Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the Ask Dr. Be Good show, the show where we share the practice, the pedagogy, and the politics currently happening in public education. As always, I ask that you write your name in the comments when you come in, and then let me know your thoughts, your observations, and questions about the topic being discussed. I'm a longtime teacher, so I enjoy having active participating classes, right? And so if you would sort of write your thoughts in the comments so that we can have a conversation back and forth. That would be, I think, exciting for everyone. Now, if you have to listen later, that's okay. If you want to put your comments in or your questions, then we will get notified and I'll answer and get back, at that time. So whether you watch us live or whether you watch us later, you still have an opportunity to interact with us. Now, let's get started. We welcome back to our show Professor Freedom, Clarence Glover, and he is helping us to get through our Black History Month and with new learning. Last week we were talking about the overall Black History Month and meanings and so forth. And again, I know people, adults, that left having learned new things about Black culture and Black happenings. And so this week, we're going to talk about the public education for Black America, past and present. And I already know I'm going to learn something new because one of the things that we've not been real good at is having the Black culture and the history of Black culture taught in our schools everywhere. I say that I know that in predominantly African-American schools, they did teach Black culture, but it wasn't to a wide enough audience. And so now we're finally getting the understanding that we need to be spreading this information out to all races so that everyone can understand the impact that our past has had on our present. So thank you. Welcome, Clarence Glover. Professor.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you today, Dr. Good.
And so talk a little bit about public education in Black America, past and present. Take it away.
Well, thank you so very, very much. Again, as we said last week, we did discuss the history and origin of African American History Month. You asked me about the question about Black versus African American. And I do like to use African American. I've been a proponent of that for many years because it is culturally proper context. We talk about Africa, a continent, a place of people. The concept of Black, as I said last week, was a term that primarily rose out of the reaction to white Americans and what it meant to have been white and versus Black. But when we speak about African American history, let me just go back a little bit beyond continent. Many people are not aware that Africa was a center of learning for many years, many hundreds of years. There's a unique term in our African American community when we were growing up. When somebody would tell you if you're having a fight or doing something else, you did something, they say, I'm going to knock you to Timbuktu. And that sort of meant a place. Where's Timbuktu? It's nowhere, it's just so far away, But as we grew and I got older and others of us studied it, we found out that Timbuktu was one of the greatest centers of learning in the world.
Oh, really?
At that time. And then people came from all over the world to study at the libraries of Timbuktu in West Africa, from Europe and others. There was Muslims and others and not who led the institutions and the books. And so a lot has been covered up, and even in Egypt, which is Kemet. And we also find there that in modern times, they separate Egypt from Africa. So you go to museums and you have the African exhibit, then you have the Egyptian exhibit, but really Egypt is Africa. And so there's that misconception again. And I'm giving you this context because, for an example, much of what we talk about in education, particularly today, we call it the Montessori method, and teaching, which uses what is called the Socratic method model. And many individuals are not aware that Socrates left Greece, where he was teaching a very linear, sort of sage on stage type of teaching, if you will, and went into Egypt and came back with this strange teaching style where it was question and answer, like you said, interactive. Well, in Greece, you're not supposed to question the sage of the state. And this is why they ultimately gave him hemlock, and his students became very radical. Well, it was that method that came out of Egypt, Africa, if you will. which is a communal call and response culture. So we have that root in Africa where we see so many things of the past. And I say that because by the time we come to America, we have this ideal of Africa has been a dark backwards continent, void of any knowledge, you see. And so it was in a historian by the name of Herbert Baxter Adams who established what is called the Teutonic origin theory. And the Teutonic origin theory is a theory that established the foundation for the academic canon, what should be taught in America, history, culture, etc. And the National Association of History used to give a award for that. But my point is that that's what established the framework for American history, if you will. So that the African component of history, so when you start studying world history, we never saw anything significant about Africa. And we know that Africa, as we know it today, was broken up at the Berlin Conference into the countries as we see today. But before that, it was Congo Empire, it was the Nubian Empire. We were empires. So here again, just like children, when I was a child, you grew up. I love history. I'm a historian. I would love the history about Europe and going to Europe and hearing about different ages and leaders and rulers. But we never heard anything about the history of Africa, like we heard about Asia. And so therein lies a problem, because we saw again Africans perceived as being backwards, slaves, etc., etc. But by the time the Civil War came along, there was this attempt to figure out what do you do now with the freed Africans, not freed slaves, because a freed slave is an oxymoron. You can't be free and a slave. So the freed Africans they were struggling with them at the time. Radical Reconstruction was a time where there were leaders in Congress, leaders in states, and so forth and so on. But by the end of 1866, from 1866 to 1877, that period of his 10-year period of history, it was very disturbing, because education was private from white men, landowners, and their sons primarily during that era. So after Reconstruction, the idea of how you educate Africans in this country came up. And that began to say these were not aristocrats' children. These were descendants of those who were enslaved. So you see many schools like Howard University being established, who was a European, who's a Union officer up north. You begin to see Fisk. And this was also unique because some of the children of the plantation owners attend these universities. As I said to you earlier, those of us, my family included, whose family had been mixed on my family side, my mother's side. So there were privileges provided for what we call light-skinned Negroes in those early days. And then lo and behold, later on, Rosenwald, a gentleman by the name of Rosenwald with Sears and Roebuck's, got with Booker T. Washington, created the Rosenwald school system, which built rural schools in the country. And I heard about those from my great-grandfather, my grandmother, my grandfather. And these were wooden schools that Sears and Roebuck, Rosenwald, and they built for the lower, if you will, rural African American. They were all over. And I remember they would often talk about the Blueback Speller and the McGuffey Reader. And these were two basic books that my ancestors always taught, because they had to learn to read and write. And that was a jewel. So that's that period. So we could say that public education in America was fundamentally a product of Reconstruction and understanding of trying to educate African Americans, and then poor whites began to be brought into the process as well.
So let me sort of summarize what I think I heard. The Rosenwald schools were originally started, and how many of them were there? Do you know?
Hundreds of them throughout the South. Booker T. Washington built. There are buildings that are still standing today. Yes, they're still standing.
Are they historical buildings now?
They haven't been. No, and that's one of the things I've been working. I have had a desire to do is to identify. Some of us talked about that because some of them are standing. They're throughout rural East Texas, Louisiana, different places, and they're just old. They're one-room buildings, if you will.
One-room schoolhouses.
One-room schoolhouses, right. I have a desk and a chair from one in my own collection. And so, yes, they were there.
So you had Rosenwald schools all over the country. Mm-hmm. for just African
African
kids.
Americans, true, yes, correct. And these were just for African American children to be educated. And out of that then came Hampton, Tuskegee, Grambling, where I went to Grambling State University. Dr. Charles P. Adams was sent there by Booker T. Washington himself. So all this is connecting, because now what you're doing, you're educating rural African Americans. And the first schools were fundamentally agricultural schools, teaching men and women how to plant. George Washington Carver, if you will, and others, can food, how to sew. This is what Booker T. Washington was very keen on, what is called pulling ourselves by our own bootstraps, and working with Carnegie, if you will, and others when he gave his speech at the World Fair. He was seen somewhat in a controversial manner because he was considered to be an accommodationist with Carnegie and others, versus W.B. Du Bois up north, who was a bit more politically radical. And for me, I say it was neither Booker T nor WB, it's Booker T and WB. So you need both the politics of the North and you need the rural work of the South going together, working together, where one works on the political rights of African American people, at that time colored people, Negroes, and the others working on the industrial side. They made their own bricks at Tuskegee and places. When I went to Grambling, my mother and father, they had farms like the peach farms and the potatoes farm. And I remember Dr. Ralph Waldo Emerson Jones, who my mother, father, and I, we all had the same president. When my mother and father went to school, that president was Ralph W.E. Jones. When I went to Grambling, my president was Ralph W.E. Jones. It's strange. And so I knew him in his latter years. But one thing that he would do, he would take sweet potato pies and bushels of potatoes down to the Board of Trustees at that time, which is all white, in Baton Rouge, because we were agriculture, if you will. And so they made their own bricks. They made their own. It was truly PBL education, project-based learning.
So let me do a timeline. So we're talking the Rosenwald schools probably were during the 19th century, the 1800s.
Correct.
And then they, when did Grambling start? Do you know when it was begun?
Grambling 19, what?
So beginning of the 20th century.
Yes.
So. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is there was a development from the rural schools for African Americans, and then it evolved into the historically Black colleges.
Colleges and universities, because what you begin to have many of the African Americans who went up north to get degrees, or then they started having the institutions down south, such as Grambling, Hampton, Southern, Alcorn, those particular historically Black colleges and universities, because we could not go to white colleges and universities at that time. We were totally against the law, segregationist laws at the time. So subsequently, we had our own institutions for that, both at an elementary level, then later on at a secondary level.
So we're making this sound a little bit easier than I'm sure it was, and you alluded to that in that they weren't allowed at the white universities, colleges, so that they then evolved into their own.
That's correct.
Which are now cherished, historically Black colleges that are there for lots of reasons, but also for support system for our African American, especially boys, right? But that's another segment probably. But it is interesting how that evolved, and it's commendable if you think about. I mean, from my standpoint, and of course, correct me anywhere that my white thinking may be off, but here you guys had all of this, racial and obstacles, and yet there were still kids being sent to school. There were still, it evolved into colleges. If we can't go to yours, we'll have our own, and great things coming out of there. There's lots of history books written about the great works that came out of the historical Black colleges of the early 20th century. And yet we still had that issue of African-American kids not being allowed at white schools.
Yes, and because of segregation, it's the same thing like with white churches and white communities. We were not allowed in, again, because of the perception that we were not human. You've used the term, one of the things that we talk about in my work also is about races. We know that scientifically there's no such thing as different races of people. There's only the human race. in many cultures. Because when we look at this ideal of races and being a white race all the way down to a black race, we have to create a caste system. And basically, white America still, as a society, lives within the context of thinking in a caste. When I say white society, I'm talking about the systemic nature of the society. And so, even in the church community, just as Richard Allen, for an example, left the Methodist Episcopal Church because they would not allow him to pray at the altar. He said, well, I'll go out and start my own. Therein lies African and Methodist Episcopal, my denomination, colored Methodist Episcopal, growing out of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which is like Southern Methodist University and others. And I also challenge white America to think about this, not only in the context of who we are as African Americans, but who European American people have been in America and are, because it is that reaction to the early history of this country, how African Americans responded to European Americans, if you will. And we have to talk about a cause and effect phenomena. If there's an effect, there has to be a cause. So we look at that cause, and we still are struggling with that, because after so many years when integration actually took place, what the unique thing that happened for us in the African American community is that we left our schools. we left our institutions. Many of them, they ended in integration. They took away our printables, if you will, in high schools and elementary schools. The integration process began in the early 60s, if you will, early 70s. And there was a great kickback from European Americans or white Americans about integration. And it affected our children who had to live under that. Just understand that I did not go through that process. The community I grew up in, which was Cooper Road, Louisiana, was the largest unincorporated African American community in the nation. We didn't integrate; they came to us. We had a few European students, white students, but for the most part, we were not bused. I've never been bused in my life. I don't know what it means to be bused. So that our community was safeguarded. But we had friends who literally, one side of the street would go to a school, white school, another side would go to another school. We heard horror stories about the buses getting bombed and spit on, and we really don't talk about that part of American history. And subsequently, we began to see the struggling with particularly European American and white teachers trying to teach African American students. And you and I have talked about that many times, and began to see now what we call this use of term at-risk students. Well, this word at-risk for me is not appropriate. It was students who lived in at-risk conditions. And we know that African American educators took African American students who came out of poverty, who came out of the rural and did great things with. They became great scholars and students. But now we see these same students put into a very, again, an at-risk situation between people who don't know them, don't understand their culture, don't understand how they learn, don't know their parents, don't go to their churches, don't shop in their stores. And now we have this problem that they're not learning.
So we sort of skipped over a lot of years. So let's sort of go back. So the 1950s was the best and the worst of times, right? It was the time when things started changing, right?
The civil rights movement was at its height, beginning to begin.
And so we had legislation. We had
Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas.
And so we had kids who were escorted, African American kids escorted into the school.
Ruby Ridges, yes.
And so
into white schools.
Into white schools. Do you have any knowledge of what happened to the predominantly African American schools when that started?
Many of them closed. They became shells. Principals lost their jobs. Teachers lost their jobs.
They weren't absorbed. They weren't absorbed by the white schools.
No, they were not absorbed by the white schools. I have many. Yeah, no. We talk about that in our community. How we saw our leaders, our people that we looked up to, our principals, our teachers, who were lost, and that's something I think we never do talk about very much. But then we don't talk about what happened when those young men and women went into those schools. Who was it that rejected them? Not just the students, but I'm talking about the administration, I'm talking about the parents, and so forth.
Well, I'll tell you, I came back to the United States in 1973 as a 15-year-old. I'd lived my life in other countries around the world. And my father's job brought him to the Dallas area. And so in 1973, I went to and was in the middle of desegregation, right? I was busing. And so I went to, first of all, I was bused to the middle school. That was not my home school. Because the thought back then, that was actually 1972. We came here for a few months, we went back overseas and then came back. So in 1972, I was bused to another middle school, and kids from, African-American kids from other communities came. And so we were brought there with the thought that if we were all brought from different neighborhoods, we would all get along. But here's what happened. When I arrived in 1972 and came to the United States to my first school, I was told, do not go to the bathroom by yourself. Mm-hmm. And basically, the school kids were angry. I still remember. I was no dummy. I think I was 14 back then. And the anger was palpable. Those kids had been bused from their predominantly African-American, or I guess, dominantly African-American schools, to now a mixed school miles from their homes. And they weren't happy about it. And so it wasn't unusual for that anger to come out in physical ways. I will tell you, I had my head bopped more than a couple of times in line. The anger, Clarence, was just palpable. And so that was an experiment done by adults to children, okay? Now, I left, came back, went to Hillcrest High School again, busing. And it was not a, and back then we didn't know about relationship building, right? I mean, your better teachers probably did because it's instinctive, but you're not so good teachers, especially in the secondary, especially in high school. What do? Well, I taught it. They just didn't come here ready to learn it, right? And so those were messy times. What do you remember about the early 70s?
Well, again, I said, I at the same time, I'm in high school. We're in similar high school. I graduated in 74, but I was at my high school, Green Oaks. We predominantly African. We had used to have white teachers, European teachers come to us. They loved it. They came to the Cooper role. They became a part of our community. Ms. Cox, Ms. All of the Mr. Jelks, different ones. Sergeant Colonel Sansalone. We still today our class reunions. They come back. Dr. Dunn, our vice principal. We have a close relationship. What I think that happens so oftentimes, we don't talk about, you talk about two things, integration and desegregation. As I've told people over the years, I have never been an integrationist in the sense of a traditional sense. More desegregation, meaning that desegregate the lunch counters. Let me go to where I want to eat. Let me go to the bathroom where I want to go drink water. But I don't think that. I think what happened is that we thought in America, and as we look at it, that white America, if you will, was the model. So what they wanted to do is get black students out of what they considered bad situation and put them in with white students and white people. And somehow through some osmosis, black children would get a better education. It was horrible. It was white.
I'm telling you, it was an experiment done by adults, white adults.
Yes, right, white adults.
I don't know. Was there any black participation? Were there black leaders who were taking part?
No, as I said, not to the most part. Thank you for saying that. It was an experiment by white administrators, and of course, at that time of history, of course, we were all still living at the mercy of white politicians for the most part in America, even during my time of high school. So, what you had was, of course, Little Rock. You had New Orleans. You had so many places. You had Dallas here. Dallas, as I have, when I come here, I hear horror stories about what happened. You not only, and I think that sometimes we should go back. Let's talk about Sankofa, my business, Sankofa Education. We should go back and bring people like you and other educators and other African American and talk about this again and begin to reflect on it so that because in Sankofa it means reaching back to fetch what you left behind. And we've left behind some conversations, some emotions that we need to deal with, because one is that the principle is that just because you put African American and European American or black students or white students, somehow there was a percent, well, they're going to get a better school. No, that's not the case. But rather, as I've said, they should have given them the best books, because we in school we got the leftover books, we got the leftover science equipment, we got the leftover athletic equipment, in our schools. Even at the school I went to, whatever the district had left over, they dumped it over there. You see, so give us the best. We could read, we could write, so subsequently, we need to revisit that view. But what happened also when you did that, not only with the students, and you brought African Americans moving in, then we had white flight. And then as you had white flight from the inner cities, you created the urban blight, if you will, and no resources. And then we have the inner city, which began known as the ghetto, if you will. And the Kerner Commission report talks about that. Dr. Otto Kerner, and your listeners can look it up. It's called the Kerner Commission report of the understanding civil disobedience in the 1960s. And what it said in summary is that what white America doesn't understand, what Black America can never forget, is that white America created the ghetto, white America supports the ghetto, and white America condones the ghetto. So they said this place that we call the ghetto is actually a created phenomena by politics and economics. And so
some of that redlining in there too.
Most definitely. All of that is a part of it, completely.
So is it your opinion that African-American students would have been better off being allowed to stay in their neighborhood schools with the same resources as what was being given to kids of, and I hate to say just white kids, because there were, Asian kids and Hispanic kids, some in other areas. I mean, if neighborhood schools in African-American communities had been given the same resources, would that have been better for those students?
I think so, because I grew up in a community like that, where we had teaching and things began to get better. We got a bigger school, we built a larger high school, etc. But we also must understand the emotional trauma that African American students were placed upon as a result of white attitudes and behaviors at that time. We don't talk about that too often. Just like we don't talk about what happened with Bull Connor in the 60s and all the racist actions with George Wallace. And who were these people and these men? Who were the women spitting on Ruby Ridges going in New Orleans? Who were these people? Why did they think this way? Why did white America feel this way? And I believe that we owe it to our history, to our nation, to ourselves, not only to look at African American history as something as though we were in a vacuum by ourselves. African American history is a relational history. Our history is in relationship to European Americans. We are who we are because of the relationship, if you will. And so when we talk about Africa, any more than when I just look at European American history here, as I said, I love history. I love studying the European American history, and European American history. And you cannot, particularly in America, separate any major European movement in this nation without understanding the presence of African people, particularly in the foundation of its history.
And you're right. I had this interesting, I don't know what to call it. I was opening a box of books. I guard books. My husband just, I'm a teacher. Okay. So I have boxes of kid books that I carry with me as if I were still teaching, because my grandkids might enjoy them, right? And I opened up this box of books, Clarence, and there were all of these books about Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims. And after all those years of training, all the years you and I have been together and all the discussions, the books were a little bit tough for me I could not send them to my grandkids. The ones that lived, they just moved to Kentucky from Georgia. And I was looking, I'm always looking, anytime I send a little something, I always send books also.
Yes.
Clarence, I'm a changed woman, and I understand that many of our books are so white-centric, so male-centric, that they just can only... And burning a book, in my mind, is...
You don't want to. I do understand.
So here's what I'm doing. I'm keeping the books so that I can use them as a why we can't use this book.
Right.
Okay?
You have a reference point, and that goes
Oh
back
my gosh.
to Herbert Bax Adams and the Teutonic origin theory, the
And
academic canon. That's where it comes out of. That's where it's manifested.
goodness gracious,
Yeah.
the fairy tale that is Thanksgiving. The,
Yes.
the fairy tale that is the Pilgrims and the relationship with
Mhm.
Native Americans. And it just, oh my goodness gracious. And so we do have history. And I know people are just, I don't know what's going to happen to the show when I say this, Clarence, but history must be rewritten. And you know,
Yes.
that's, oh my gosh, we can't rewrite history. We can fill
Well,
in.
we did at DISD when you and I were there. At DISD when I was assistant in charge of multicultural affairs, we developed a multicultural textbook adoption process, and that process was that we made sure that all the textbooks that we would adopt in the district would be multiculturally inclusive. That allowed McGraw-Hill and other textbooks, and it changed the nation actually, because for a period of years, textbooks had to think through what we're talking about and to make sure that there was a presence and a understanding. That then was challenged by the state board when it became very conservative, talking about politics here, when it became a conservative board, and then they began to kick that out. And so we need to get back to a multicultural, inclusive curriculum and development, textbooks and other things and staff. And we're now seeing, we're at a point, just like on January the 6th, we are seeing a reaction of white kickback because our nation is changing. The demographics are no longer questionable. They are now certain that they're people of color, of Hispanic, of African American, of Asian, now permanent fixtures in our American politics, in our American educational system. So we need to recognize that we are here together forever.
We do, and that's, we're not going to solve it today, but we need to acknowledge the fact that that conversation needs to happen. And I was on a forum today, and it was put on by the Asian Chamber, and you know, there are the Asian community also feels like they are stereotyped, and it was interesting in my research in trying to understand how it is that the Asian community, oftentimes, if you'll remember, well, of course, you know that they've been compared to the African American community for 100 years, right? And about why do they seem to do better and so forth. Well, after all the research, what we found out, Clarence, is the reason why it seems like Asian Americans do better than African American um, communities is because they're viewed in a less racist way by the white community. So
Well, they are, and plus
it's everywhere.
they
It's
are.
not that they're smarter. It's not that they're this, that, and the other. It's that they are viewed in a less racist way.
Well, what happens is
Much
the
money.
African American America has always been an evolving white America because we moved from white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to evolve to the point where people who have been grafted into what we call whiteness, Italians, Irish, et cetera, even Hispanics today. So we see that African Americans will never be grafted into being white, if you will, and so we still have that. But I think that one more point you were making about that we must also recognize that in America we must educate our students for a multicultural world. Technology, all of these things. We live in a world, Dr. King, a world house now. We don't live in the South alone anymore. In the South of America, we live in a world community, and just as you have done, led with legacy with the Chinese and language and other things that we talk about our African American Hispanic students. We're talking about educating our students to each other, but African Americans, unlike other cultures, we don't know ourselves as deeply as an Asian culture knows itself, or as a Hispanic culture knows itself. See, or as a Europe, and that's one of the things I often say that I use a comparison. A statement I said, it's like plumbing being broken in your house. If the plumbing is broken in your house and the plumbing is broken next door, whose plumbing will you fix? You have to fix your plumbing. If the plumbing is not broken next door, and you definitely have to fix the plumbing in your house. And I say that African Americans, we have some plumbing to do. We have some work on our plumbing because oftentimes we're actually be pulled away from working on us. That's what people look at. I'm not saying I don't want to talk to other coaches, but I have to work on my culture, my plumbing now, so that they will be able to work and talk to others. So this little student has to know something about his or herself to know and talk to a Hispanic student or Asian student
So let's
or a
talk a little
European.
bit. We've got about 5 minutes left for what you are in schools. You are in schools around at all levels, really. Do you feel like schools are doing better in reaching the African American student? And so let me leave it at that. Do you feel like we in public education are doing better now than we have in the past?
When we look at the word public education, word education, as you know, when I do my training, I always like to define the word education. It comes from the Latin word educata, which gives the word educe, which means to draw out the best. So if we use the word education in its authentic term, are we pulling out the best in African American students? I would say no. I would say no because I think that to pull the best out of any student, you must first have a thought of what is in that culture within that student. When I worked at SMU, when I taught at SMU, when I'm looking at European American students, I'm dealing with African American students. I know that if I said certain things, I know there's certain things about the European American student, white student, that they know about themselves already. You see, that they feel about themselves. I know Hispanic students have certain things within themselves, and things I could say in that could pull some things out. What I did with even the term African. Do you know how many African Americans, Black, who if I say African, I'm not African. I'm not from Africa. Oh, it's good. But I could use the word European descent, your Asian descent, and students will raise their hands and we'll talk about it. Well, if I say, okay, students of African descent in the room, we're going to talk. No one raises their hand because they are programmed to think a certain way. The term Black, again, is not an academic term. It's not an academic term. So subsequently, most educators or teachers, if you because they're not really putting the best out. Most teachers, Black, African American, white or Black, do not know the African American person, a culture. So I submit to you, as you just stated, if we say, are we doing our best? We don't even know what the measure. We don't even know what the base is yet. You know, we don't have a baseline yet to understand what that means when we're educating African American. For an example, if I'm talking about my European students, I'm saying we're talking about the Renaissance, Baroque, the Byzantine Empire. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment period. We're going to talk about Greece. We're going to talk about mythology. I can just go on down the list and start talking about characters and King Arthur and Guinevere and this, that. What are you going to talk about the African American child? What knowledge do you have about Africa that even begins to let this child have a historical reference point? I'll submit to you that most of us, we don't know it.
Well, my hope is that we're getting better at them as a public education entity with all that's going on. And of course, I don't want to steal the thunder from other weeks. So,
yes.
So let's talk about, let's see, in week 3, we're going to talk about the civil rights era, your and your meeting with the different activists, Rosa Parks and
Mrs. Parks, Mrs. King,
yeah,
Dr.
yeah,
Lafayette, John
and
Lewis. Yes.
Yeah, we look forward to that discussion with you next week and bringing your continued insight and what can we do if those of us who are white Americans to open up ourselves a little bit to understand maybe white privilege is a real thing.
One thing I'm going to say, just hear me, is sum it up in one word. African American students and African American people must have the same opportunity to have a classical history as other cultures. And that's a mere broader, what is our classical history? Just as you have a European classical history, a European text. And when we understand it, because it's our history, it becomes the foundation of our other knowledge of ourselves, you see. And that's one of the things I've been working at, trying to help people understand that we do have a classical African history that predates slavery and that informs our history.
So thank you. We could, I know, talk forever. And so I'm just, we get at least this month to keep touching base with you and picking your brain and hearing your experiences and just the richness of that. So thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Dr. Good. We appreciate what you're doing.
And we look
Thank you.
forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you so kindly. Thank you.
All right. Just, again, so many new things, so much new information. I'm glad I'm a lifelong learner because this is just fascinating to me. Okay, so last week we had talked about the COVID vaccine and whether teachers were being allowed to take part in that. And I brought you some data from other states around the country. And so at that time, 17 states allowed teachers to sort of be next, to bump ahead of everybody else after the healthcare workers. Well, guess what? We now have 26 states. In 1 week's time, it's gone from 17 states to 26 states, which is good. And so be listening for your state, everyone. Let's see. These are the no's, okay? Because there's less no's. So there's Alaska, Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Missouri, Indiana, Missouri, I said that, Montana, Louisiana, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, North and South Carolina, from Washington State, Texas, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. So let's see, the West Virginia teachers, interestingly enough, they can go if they're over 50 and get it now. And then we don't have data on Vermont and Rhode Island. Washington State is a no. So if your state is still a no, what should you do? Remember, gosh, I hope your first thought was I need to write my legislator or I wrote my legislator. My hope is that is your sort of go-to action piece, right? Especially right now. So many of your states are in legislative session right now, and your legislators need to hear from you that you are outraged. I have talked, I would tell you, I have been on radio stations. I have anywhere I can. I've been on TV about this. I just did something with the Asian Chamber and talked about the fact that we have a missed opportunity when it has come to making our educators, and when I say educators, please, food service, bus drivers, custodians, all of those administrators involved in going to a school building that is open and has kids going every day. We have missed an opportunity to make them feel valuable and valued by us and by the rest of the society by allowing them to get the vaccine sooner rather than later. We have so many educators who are anxiously waiting for the vaccine, and in those states with unions have flat out said, we're not going to school until we get the vaccine. And if we are of the opinion, and I say opinion, it's a research one, everybody knows that kids who go to school don't lose as much instruction as kids who are learning virtually for the most part. You have your anomaly kids, but it is better for kids to be in school every day than to be learning from home. And yet, if we can't get our teachers there, if we can't get our teachers feeling safe, then we haven't done our job for that, for educators. And so we just need to understand that. And for those states that are still not where they should be when it comes to getting those teachers allowed to vaccine, let's get them. Let's see if we can get those numbers up by next week. Okay, so this is also the lunar New Year, and it's the year of the ox. And some of you say, well, what does that have to do with public education? Well, that's celebrated in a lot of schools. I don't know if you all know that, but for example, in my school, we have English, Spanish, and Chinese as part of our dual language programs. And so we certainly want to celebrate the cultural pieces that go with learning Mandarin. And so the Lunar New Year is this time of year, and this is the year of the ox. And so I thought it'd be fun to read to you people born in the ox. And I'm sure that most of you have gone to a Chinese restaurant, you've seen the menu, and around the menu you can find the year you were born and what animal corresponds to the year you were born and which one corresponds to the Chinese lunar year, right? So people born in the year of the ox are strong, reliable, fair, and conscientious, inspiring confidence in others, and they are also calm, patient, methodical, and can be trusted. Although they say little, they can be very opinionated. They believe strongly in themselves, but are also stubborn and hate to fail or to be challenged. So, there's always good and bad about each one of the animals in the lunar year zodiac. So if you are either Asian, Happy New Year, or you have kids that go to a school that celebrate that, you can slip your teacher a red envelope, because one of the things that happens at the Chinese lunar year is that kids and unmarried adults get a little red purse that has usually a gold symbol on it, a good luck symbol, and it has money in there. And so you can slip a teacher a little gift card in there or something, which goes right along with the fact that we have Valentine's Day coming. Valentine's Day is today, and if you haven't sent your teacher or had your kids send a teacher a happy Valentine's, maybe do it tomorrow, do it Monday, and just have your kids send them a nice email, or have them draw a picture, and then you can take a snapshot with it with your phone and send it through email. But just teachers need to feel valued and important by your kids and by their families that they teach. And so one of the nicest things that you could do is to do something special for the teacher, right? And so I've given you some ideas there for both the Chinese Lunar New Year and Valentine's Day. But make sure that your teacher gets a little virtual hug from you, your kids, and your family as a thank you for the work that they do every day, whether in face-to-face or whether virtual. And so let's see, the last thing I want to chat about before, gosh, always our hour is so fast, is what's happening in the Biden administration and in public education. What changes are they talking about, right? Well, they do have an extended learning as a priority in their $129 billion COVID relief bill, right? Is that good news? It is good news if the money makes it all the way through. And I say that it is not unusual for federal bucks to come to the states, and it filters out in a way that isn't often felt by the public schools themselves. Now, it could be because the education agency that received it used it for some other things, and maybe that was important too, but it just wasn't tangible for the schools, right? So we'll see if it feels tangible for the schools. One of the things that the Biden administration is really wanting to put a lot of money in is summer school and extended year for kids who have been impacted by COVID slide. And so let's see, the latest release proposal in Congress would require districts to use at least 20% of their aid on addressing learning loss through programs like summer school, while states would have to set 5% for the same thing. So that would be 25% of money that schools would have to use to help with this COVID slide during summer school, extended year. Schools could also use the funding to improve HVAC systems, which that sounds odd until you remember that we need to get those classrooms and the air cleaned in it better, so the cooties don't stay in there. Reduce class size, implement social distancing, hire support staff, and address a wide variety of other needs and expenses to help schools reopen safely. So this proposal isn't final, of course. It hasn't made its way all the way through Congress, but it does provide $67 billion for K-12 schools. And because remember, when we're talking public education, we're also talking public higher ed, and we're also talking, oftentimes we're also talking some relief for private schools. We don't often think about that in our public ed world, but private schools do get some funding, some grants and so forth. So it's not a lot, and there's some conditions to it, but which is why many private schools tend not to want to do it. But so long story short, they are understanding too that the money needs to go to the high needs areas. As always, you all have heard me say that the worst impact has been on our special need kids. It's been on our poverty kids, our second language kids. They're the ones who are going to need to get the bigger amount of money to shore up those needs and to work hard at making up the gaps. And so parents, be on guard, be on the lookout, not in a bad way, but be looking out for your schools to be saying to you, we need your kids to stay for tutoring. We need your kids to stay for summer school. We need your kids to start the school year early or to have intersessions next year. There are schools all over the country looking for intersessions. And so, and when I say looking for intersessions, what I mean by that is extending the school year by, let's say, 15 days, and then putting 5 days extra in the first semester where the teachers meet in small groups for half a day, and then extend winter break, let's say, again, intersession, working small groups, and then at spring break, adding another week to extend the year and the learning for small groups. There's all sorts of models. We can talk about that later in the semester, but please understand, almost no child has been left unaffected by COVID and the lack of learning and the lack of school. So we will be reaching out to parents and asking them to please, please, please let us have their kids for more time to start making up for that instruction that was lost. The other thing that I want to remind everyone in the last couple minutes, one is social emotional resources. Last week we talked about the fact that we have lots of new social emotional resources on a nationwide basis. If you don't know what they are, you can go to last week's podcast. We have it in the comments. Loya Montoya put that in there. We also have them in the different educational service centers, in the state agencies. There are just social emotional resources to be had, oftentimes free for kids and parents. You have to be open to reaching out and letting yourself take advantage of those. And then the second thing I want to remind everyone is to reach out to your legislators. You are the public advocacy army. And so I ask you to take this duty seriously, because you can make a difference. You are making a difference. If you've reached out to your legislators already, please continue to do so, so that they get to know your name, they get to hear your voice, and they get to understand what you need for them to do and how to vote for upcoming bills that have to do with public education and its funding. We can't do it without you folks. And if we can get all of you thinking in that way, imagine the change that we can make in not only getting our kids more funding as far as the different programmatic needs that they have, social emotional needs that they have, but also our teachers. If we can bump up those salaries, and people tend to raise their eyes, folks. But I will talk probably next week more about the looming teacher shortage that we have coming on. We must pay attention to our teachers, or we will be in a world of hurt. So more about that in a future show. But for now, thank you for being on. I hope you left a little bit more educated in some of the good things happening in public education, some of the things that are concerning us in public education, and of course, some of the politics. You even heard politics at work when we were talking to Professor Freedom today, right? Politics, it's just everywhere in public education. But mostly, I hope that you left with the understanding of how important all of this is. All of us must be part of helping kids become more than hourly wage graduates. We need career-minded taxpayers who will help keep our economy strong in the future. And if we don't help those kids today, they're not going to be there to help us when we need them the most. So join me in my PubEd advocacy army, and